liberty. Just remember it home.
Talk about secret agendas. This one really takes the cake.
We're so proud.
A group of people get together in Rio de Janeiro in 1992,
We're so
call their gathering an Earth Summit, and then proceed to draw up documents designed to reorganize Western civilization.
victory.
Boy, what a nifty little plan they've come up with. First of all, they want to get the human population reduced down to between 1 and 2 billion from the current 5.6 billion. Then they want to have all of civilization organized around their bioregions, setting aside 50% of the land mass of America and Canada into wilderness areas called reserves, interconnected by corridors and surrounded by buffer zones. And then they want wolves and other carnivores to be given supreme rights of movement, with the ability to run free in all the native areas where no human use will be allowed. If these people didn't take themselves so seriously, this would be one of the greatest comedies ever written. So join us as my guest, Dr. Michael Kaufman, scientist and author of Saviors of the Earth, and I discuss the Biodiversity Treaty, the Green Globalist Agenda of the UN, and other environmental and socialist organizations and people, including the Clinton administration and the State Department, who are determined to put mankind on the back burner and take over the Earth.
Let the foe get the message loud and clear. In the ones who fight for us, there is no fear.
Thank you very much for joining me again this week. My name is Terry Kennedy. I'm the host of The Truth as I See It. And this is really part 2 of a 2-part series where we are discussing the Biodiversity Treaty, and I venture to say that probably 90–95%, maybe closer to 100, of the people out in America really have no idea what this is all about and what's in store if these secret agenda people have their way. Without anything any further, I just want to go ahead and thank Michael Kaufman for being with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, Terry.
You're sure welcome. We've got a lot of important material to cover. We got probably halfway through some of your overhead slides here last week, and just for the folks that didn't catch us last week, give us just a brief background and tell the folks what you're doing.
Well, basically, what is happening with environmental leadership, and again, it's confined to environmentalist leadership. 95% of those people who call themselves environmentalists are there because they're concerned by what they're being told and want to do the right thing. But environmental leadership is taking us off in a whole different direction that the American people are unaware of. Mm-hmm. If they knew the magnitude of what they are planning, they would not support this leadership whatsoever. Who in this country would support a plan to eliminate 2 out of 3 of us? And that's yet what we found in the Convention on Biological Diversity last week when we discussed it, that this very same leadership proposed in this convention are to turn us back basically to serfdom, mm-hmm. as human agrarian peasants, as they used in their own words, basically denying us of all recreational opportunities, totally restructuring our belief system, cultural aspects, and our economies. The impact of the Biodiversity Treaty, had it been ratified, would have affected every man, woman, and child in this nation in a horribly negative way. And yet almost none of you out there in the listening audience understood what was really happening. You probably didn't even hear about it.
No.
It's incredible. One of the things that we want to pick up today, I think, is concerning the constitutional issues of why our founding fathers were so adamant on establishing the Constitution to prevent us from ever returning to a feudal form of government. And in a way of introduction to this, I'd just like to basically say that the Convention on Biological Diversity would totally and radically deny us our property rights as we currently exist, to have them today in our nation.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, because most people can relate to that.
Because the Constitution really is established around the concept of property rights.
Mm-hmm.
And in this new vision of our new world society, basically what they would say, coming out of the Global Biodiversity Assessment, this United Nations document in Section 8.1, is that because biodiversity is in very large measure a public good, part of the global commons, then anything we do on our property affects biodiversity, which is a global commons. Mm-hmm. And therefore we must elevate property rights then up to a global basis. and deny the local individual the use of their land without being told what they can and cannot do.
Now, they're going to have some sort of global police, like walking up and down the streets,
that's
aren't
exactly right. I'm going to get to that in just a moment.
Okay.
But in these documents, they talk about reallocation of property rights. They talk about the redistribution of assets. Any number of things that has very dire consequences on both you and I and every American, as well as our society as a whole. Here they talk about the fact that ecosystems, the reason is that ecosystems cross boundaries and so forth, jurisdictional boundaries, and they are in the nature of public goods. And property rights then are then relegated to this type of thing, where the United Nations, basically the environmental global facility, would then direct as to how much harvesting can occur around the world, issue emission permits and that sort of thing.
Okay.
That's their vision of property rights, is basically you're allowed to do so much of some things at some time. And it's going to be limited to that level.
And nothing outside of that.
Really nothing outside of that. And it's long discussions on that particular thing. What is disturbing, of course, I think to many Americans are excessive police powers, and yet that is the central point of the Convention on Biological Diversity, is that states have the right to have police powers to stop people from doing certain types of activities. And it says right here that this appears in the Biodiversity Convention and is a very strong measure or point within the convention to increase police powers to be able to enforce all of these things.
Oh, yeah, and it won't be just getting stopped on the highway. They'll say that satellite transmission indicates that something's going on in the backyard here, and
That's correct.
We're here to
they have that
out.
technological ability to basically become a super police force.
Right.
And ironically, now that we mention that, if you look at Section 10 of the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment, it basically says that the law should clearly establish the conditions of participation in the decision-making process of NGOs. Well, NGOs are sanctioned non-governmental organizations within the United Nations. And the only ones that can be an NGO, sanctioned NGO, are environmental organizations like the Wilderness Society, the Sierra Club, and so forth and so on, National Audubon. Any group that's a 501(c) in this nation that is trying to uphold property rights, for instance, would never be a sanctioned NGO within the United Nations.
No, no way.
And so here they're basically given the same status, legal status, as a nation, as the United States.
And these are unelected people. They've just organized. They've decided to get together and call themselves something, and then they have more power than an elected government.
That's correct. It's astonishing what this document contains. It basically says the legal standing of these NGOs are necessary to ensure that governments comply with all of this stuff, that there are proper assessments and consultation procedures have been followed out of the treaty, and then finally, if somebody doesn't do things the way they want them to do, they can sue them. It's an incredible document. As we indicated and discussed in our last session, this document is basically the most astonishing document that probably has ever been published. And it was denied the U.S. Senate several times during the summer of 1994. The United Nations basically told the U.S. Senate that this document did not exist.
This is amazing.
The other thing that the NGOs would be involved in Section 10, pages 270 to 271, is to basically shift all decision-making processes up to a bioregional basis. And that within those bioregions, the basic social and commercial services of the communities that live within them would be found. In other words, it'd be basically self-sufficient. There wouldn't be any international trade. And that it would all be administered by a central or local government, private community, and communal tenure rights.
Now, these would be people that are living within the areas that these people have decided only can be used for human population.
Yes.
Outside of which are these buffer zones where, and we were discussing this earlier, what they're really, if they want to take over the earth, they really don't want to give 50% of the land away to the wolves and the carnivores. They're going to be, I don't know, what, hiding there, setting up their military
Who
structure?
knows? At least it would give them control of the natural resources that are in those areas. And where you control the land, you control the people. Our founding fathers made that very clear. The so-called bioregions has actually been published in Sierra Magazine, the 1994 March-April issue. And this is their vision for these bioregions. And notice right here, I live in Maine right now. This is my current place of residence. And in 1989, the environmental groups pressured Congress to pass a law that would create the Northern Forest bioregion with an overarching commission, just like what we saw in the actual text of the Global Biodiversity Assessment.
Wow.
And only because the people rose up and said no, was that process basically stopped dead in its tracks.
I see.
I mean, this is actually happening as we speak. But it was the Section 10 on page 149 that was the smoking gun that we got and actually were able to use to stop the process 1 hour before the ratification process would have been terminated.
Wow.
And that basically is found in what is known as, they're saying that they're going to be depending on the Wildlands Project as a central organizing principle of how all of this should be integrated. Mm-hmm. And the Wildlands Project, and we've been telling the Senate this all summer long, but there was not that smoking gun, that direct linkage. The Wildlands Project, as you alluded earlier on, basically calls for setting 1/2 of the land area of the countermenace United States in these core wilderness areas and reserves, all surrounded by buffer zones and interconnected by corridors. Mm-hmm. And they would then be the central areas where wildlife and nature can roam free without human intervention. Mm-hmm. And it was a set of maps that we had anticipated, because we knew how they thought. We had anticipated that this would be the process by which they would try to attempt to do this. And what you see here, these maps were introduced on the Senate floor on September 30th, 1994, and basically showed the U.S. Senate what this would look like in the areas that we had actually mapped. Now, the areas that are blank will eventually be mapped, but we just didn't have the time to put it all together.
Yeah.
But here you can see in the northwest and down into the southern Rockies, the magnitude of this effort, as these red zones are basically made to be human exclusion areas. We cannot go in those areas other than perhaps to appreciate, as they said in ecoterrorism, the process of that, how nature actually works.
Yeah. Now that green area there, you had pointed out earlier, is the area where this, I have an article I pulled up out of the St. Paul Pioneer Press on October 4th that talks about how there was a forest down there in Asheville, North Carolina, that was named the United Nations Biosphere Reserve. And people got outraged.
Yes.
And
right.
so they had to pull the words United Nations off of it, but they say, you know, these people are a bunch of extremists. They call them some extremist groups, claim the existence of a conspiracy to disarm Americans, make U.S. currency worthless, and promote a new world order with the United Nations the sole government. Yeah. Why don't they stay off a couple of those issues and stay right on the issue? This is a UN biosphere.
This is a UN biosphere right here. There are 47 of these around the country that occupy some 43 million acres. It's happening right now as we speak. And these people don't know anything about it, and it's being implemented on a gradual basis.
Set that up there so we can take a picture of that just as we speak, just so that you get a picture of that article. Yeah, so this has got to change big time. And I don't know, where do we go next?
Where do we go next?
Yeah.
Well, ironically, what had happened is on September 9th, 1995, the United Nations basically came to Yellowstone National Park at the invitation of 20 environmental groups and the U.S. Department of Interior, under Secretary Bruce Babbitt and his underling, George Frampton, and announced to the people in there that they were assuming jurisdiction over a buffer zone, one of these buffer zones that we've been talking about, outlined here in yellow, that occupies between 14 and 18 million acres, half of which is private land. And they are assuming land use control jurisdiction.
They just waltzed in there and said,
waltzed
well,
in there and
it's time for
basically
us to take over.
And they even used the words that they don't want to have reverse imperialism, but you can fill in the blanks.
Wow.
But that actually happened during the week of September 9th through the 12th, 1995.
So what happened?
Well, basically, the people, once they realized what was happening, it rose up in arms and had a public hearing on September 11th that basically said to get out of here. And many of the senators and congressmen in the 3 state regions basically are looking into this as we speak to see what can be done. Mm-hmm. But this is happening. This is derived not from the Convention on Biological Diversity, but from basically a proposal that was a treaty that we signed in 1972 called the World Heritage Convention.
Oh, yeah.
We have a lot of these treaties out there that are starting to be used now to implement this agenda that we've been talking about.
Yeah, they went ahead and got them in.
They went ahead and got them in.
Now they're starting
and
to
it's a very small step then to convert the public lands around that area either into core wilderness are buffer zones as described in the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Is the yellow is buffer zones, the red you can't go into, and where can people live?
Well, that's it. There's not very many places.
Amazing.
It is amazing when you really look and see how they can do this. And let me just show you a potential strategy that they may actually be using. I have no evidence that they're using this, but right now there's a law being considered in Congress called the Heritage Program. And we have the Mississippi Heritage Corridor right here that's being considered. It impacts about 7.8 million people. If we expand that particular concept in the upper Midwest, for instance, to all of the tributaries of the Mississippi River and in the minor rivers, then you're up to about 52 million people that are being impacted by having federal jurisdiction along these major river corridors. And then you can begin to convert federal and public lands into these corridors and reserves. And then finally, up in the upper right-hand corner, you can begin to see this process. And let me just zero in on that with this one. And this would be an example of what could happen in the upper Midwest.
Right here in Minnesota.
And this only shows about 30% of the area in red. And they're asking for 50%.
I see.
It's astonishing what they are really, really all about and trying to do.
Amazing.
And it's not just confined, as we saw with the World Heritage Convention, that treaty, to the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is taken from an internal EPA working document in 1993 that basically says that we need to fulfill the United States' existing international obligations, in other words, the Convention on Biological Diversity. We hadn't even ratified the treaty yet, and the EPA is already implementing the provisions of the treaty without it ever being ratified.
I'm almost dumbfounded.
You're almost dumbfounded. And finally, when you look at what the President's Council on Sustainable Development, this is only 6 out of 16 goals that were published in a draft version in March of 1995, where it calls for a network of conservation areas. That sound familiar?
Yeah.
The realignment of social and economic and market forces using both incentives and disincentives. The full accounting of natural resource stocks, identical to the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment that's coming out of the President's Council on Sustainable Development.
Yeah, using all the same words.
Using all the same words and phrases. Talks about bioregions and the fact that we must establish regional cooperation and governance.
Interesting.
Every single point that's in this treaty is in the President's Council on Sustainable Development.
Well, it sounds like this is the reason Clinton was made our president then, doesn't it?
Yes.
Kind of?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, I would suspect that this is the heart of what they talked about in reinventing our government.
Yeah. Yeah.
A year or so ago. Now, Inside EPA, which is a magazine that's published monthly, the April 28, 1995 issue quoted several of the council members on the President's Council on Sustainable Development, and they basically acknowledged that this is so radical that it has very little chance of being implemented. What they didn't say is it's already being implemented.
Oh.
And the fact that we have one of them basically saying that if I am a conservative Republican on Capitol Hill, this is red meat for me to say that the Clinton administration is practicing social engineering. That is an understatement. It's social engineering in a way that this nation has never seen before in its history.
No.
The impacts are potentially devastating to our economy and to every man, woman, and child.
Not even was it this bad probably at the time of the colonies. Well, I mean, they basically set themselves aside.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Now, the problem with this, if you read Vice President Al Gore's book, Earth on the Balance, what you'll see many times repeated in that book is the call for making the earth the central organizing principle of our society. And here is a United Nations document that actually visualizes that concept, where the earth is the central organizing entity, and you have protected areas that we've been describing, biotechnology, ecological research around that as the most important activity that mankind can do. Those forestry activities, agricultural activities, and so forth that fit within those limits have the next importance. And then finally, our economy, human rights, property rights, land tenure, consumption and waste, even the human population itself has the least priority in this scheme. And we find that governance is therefore starting at the international level and works down towards the city, farm, village, forests, and grasslands where we as Americans live.
I see.
So we have a power structure that is from the top down, the international or global level down through the national, bioregional, and so forth. What this gives is basically all the decision-making power to this group of people right here. Perhaps at the United Nations level, they don't actually say the United Nations, but since it's a United Nations document, one would assume that, that that's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And Madison, in framing the Constitution, basically defined tyranny as the accumulation of all power. And that's exactly what that model we just looked at does. It accumulates all powers in the hands of a few. Jefferson goes on to actually diagram this by saying that this is a diagram that Thomas Jefferson wrote or framed in using or framing the Constitution, where all power is in the ruling elite. This is what has existed in Europe in their control over the colonies at the time. Then there was a national, what powers are filtered down to the national level, then they decide how they want to filter down to the community level, and finally the individual has the least power at all, of all. And Jefferson goes on to say that to break this, he knows of no safe depository of the ultimate powers, but of the people themselves. That we must have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And he developed another model, what he called the People's Law. And the People's Law basically the individuals have all the power.
Yes.
That they then give portions of it to the communities, the community cities, the city councils and so forth, to the county commissioners, to the many states, and finally the least power is within the federal government. Unless we go back to this type of structure, we are losing our freedoms. And every one of the officials in each one of these levels of government are responsible to the people that are within their jurisdiction.
Right.
And the laws that are to be passed, according to what Madison and so forth of other founding fathers said, that those must be kept at the local level. If they impact human beings, they must be kept at the local level, not at the federal government. They were deathly afraid of the federal government, having just come out of the feudal structure of Europe and knowing what federal power can do. Federalism, the root word is foidius. The root word of feudalism is also foidius. They're one and the same.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, they had just fought. It was just like yesterday to them. I mean, the problem today is that this is like so long ago, 200 years, that people, they can't relate to it.
They just can't relate to it. And just to kind of wrap this up, in case anybody ever forgot that the federal government was supposed to have extremely restricted powers, the 10th Amendment was added to enforce the idea that the federal government had no more powers than that delegated by the Constitution. And as you well know, as we sit here discussing, they have totally abandoned that principle, and almost all power now resides within the federal government. The federal government basically is the supreme law of the land. And when Thomas Jefferson basically said that when that happens, when all powers are drawn to Washington, it will destroy the Republican form of government that we described and discussed in our last session, where all the power is distributed amongst the states, the Supreme Court, or the legislative, executive, and judicial branches and so forth, to dilute that power base. When it all begins to come back up to the federal government, he basically says that our government will become as venal and as oppressive as the government from which we have separated. And we're literally seeing that today happen, with people being tyrannized, not by horrible federal agents, but by a system that guarantees tyranny.
Yeah.
It is established, it is shocking. What has happened is that we're beginning to see the changing from the People's Law that we described earlier back to the feudal ruler structure of government because of special interest groups that are extremely powerful. Most people believe that the environmental leadership and environmentalists that work in the Sierra Club and so forth are extremely poor. They are not. They're very wealthy. They have between $3 to $5 billion a year to spend on their programs. Most presidents have 6-digit incomes and so forth. And they have tremendous power in Congress that Congress then has used to create all of these laws that we now have to deal with that are costing every American family, it's estimated, between $8,000 and $16,000 per family per year.
Wow.
That are not needed. They don't do a thing to protect the environment, but they give tremendous control to federal bureaucrats. And the federal bureaucrat, at the instruction, basically, of these special interest groups, has now the power to enforce without any recourse, because they're no longer accountable to the individual people, to actually come down and punish individuals that get out of line.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can see that. Well, we got less than a couple of minutes left, thereabouts, and I'm going to ask you to wind it up. I guess basically I want to invite my viewers to go ahead and use the information that's on the credit, the tail end here, to get in touch with you. You've got an 800 number.
That's correct.
And get your pencil and paper out and write that down. As a matter of fact, you got the 800 number on the top of your head?
It's 1-800-799-9878.
Okay, yeah, and they can call that and then also write to you. Get information. They should book you. They should. Looks like you're going to be on a national speaking tour here before you know it.
I think
you already
so.
are.
In many ways, I am. I travel all over the country. I've published a number of books on biodiversity, on a book called Saviors of the Earth.
Put both of those alongside of each other there on the.
Okay.
Yeah, and we get a video picture of them.
And I would challenge the listening audience that they need to get involved in their political system. They need to challenge candidates that are running for office. Whether or not they fully understand why the Constitution was written. It's not just enough to say that, do you know what the Constitution is? But why was it written? Why was it written to protect you and I?
Yeah.
So that at least if they don't understand it, then don't vote for them.
Yeah.
Because what they're doing is taking us back to the feudal structure of government that will guarantee tyrannism and the loss of all of our freedoms. And that's a challenge. If you feel motivated, then the citizen should run for office, run for Congress. It's astonishing. In 1994, many private citizens that never dreamed that they could win won.
They won. Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing because the people in America realize there's something wrong. They don't know what.
Yeah. Michael Kaufman, God bless you for being with me today.
Thank you.
Okay. Do your part, folks. Do your part.